What was the Mexican Revolution and in what year did it begin? Every November 20th, Mexico commemorates the day of the Mexican Revolution. The date marks a historical period that culminated in the promulgation of the Mexican Constitution. The revolution on November 20th, 1910 at 6 p.m. in the Plan of San Luis. That document rejected the elections that had led to the re-election of Porfirio Diaz and called for free elections and democratic, and urged Mexicans to take up arms against the government, according to an article published on the Mexican government website and the interim document. On this date, several uprisings occurred that the Diaz government was unable to quell, and, at the end of May 1911, Generals Pascual Orozco and Francisco Pancho Villa captured Ciudad Juarez, in Chihuahua, representing a victory for the rebels. Thus, on May 25, 1911, Porfirio Diaz resigned from the presidency. After the elections in October of that year, Francisco I. Madero rose to the presidency. In what was the first stage of the Mexican Revolution, the Mexican government states on its website. Besides Orozco and Villa, other major revolutionary leaders who supported Madero's cause included Emiliano Zapata and Alvaro Obregón, among others. Porfirio Diaz's period was from 1876 to 1911, 30 years in power. Porfirio Diaz was president of Mexico for 30 years. After his heroism leading troops against the French, he attempted to seize the presidency through a coup against President Benito Juarez in the failed La Noria revolt of 1871. His Tuxtepec revolt, just before the 1876 elections against President Sebastián Lerdo de Tejeda, was successful, and he then served as president from November 23, 1876, to November 30, 1880. During this period, he reassured American investors and restored relations with European powers. Manuel González was elected president for the next 4 years, while Diaz served as Minister of Development and Governor of Oaxaca. In 1884, Diaz returned to the presidency, remaining in office until 1911. During his presidency, Diaz and his advisors transformed Mexico by building railroads, schools, and creating a robust infrastructure base for the country. They developed the principles of an oil industry and persuaded foreign capital to invest in mines and factories. However, their government did all this at the expense of basic political rights and economic control. Many critics of the regime were imprisoned or killed. As the decades passed, Diaz relied increasingly on political fraud and the military to maintain his grip on power. After 1900, this system began to deteriorate due to the president's advanced age and the lack of consensus on a successor, the rise of political and economic nationalism, and the economic recession in the United States. Ultimately, guerrilla warfare in the South and military defeats in the North contributed to Diaz's overthrow, and on May 21, 1911, his supporters signed the Treaty of Ciudad Juarez with Francisco Madero. Diaz resigned on May 25 and shortly thereafter left for Paris, where he died in 1915 and was buried in the famous Père Lachaise Cemetery. Development of the Mexican Revolution. On November 20, 1910, the first armed movements of the Mexican Revolution began, supported by Pascual Orozco, leader of the irregular troops of the state of Chihuahua, Francisco Pancho Villa, leader of the peasants in northern Mexico, and Emiliano Zapata, who represented the peasants and other popular leaders of southern Mexico. These leaders fought together in their opposition to Diaz. However, they were not allies, as each championed the specific needs of the people they represented and for whom they clashed. Following this pressure, on May 25, 1911, Porfirio Diaz resigned the presidency after signing a pact with Francisco I. Madero, who was subsequently elected president and served as president of Mexico. Madero restored the constitution, prohibited re-election, and established universal suffrage. However, these changes were insufficient to improve the overall situation of the country, nor to satisfy the needs of the people. Main causes of the Mexican Revolution: social inequality and the concentration of wealth. During the Porfiriato, the country experienced significant economic growth. However, wealth remained concentrated in the hands of a few Mexicans and a few foreigners. There was no political freedom. The people could not elect any representatives within the state or federal powers. These were imposed by Porfirio Diaz, who, despite being against re-election, remained in power for more than 30 years. Land dispossession from peasants. Diaz made a series of reforms to the legislation that facilitated the entry of foreign companies to take over vacant lands which belonged to indigenous people, peasants, or very poor people who did not have the money to work their lands and were dispossessed of them. Creation of large estates. The vast haciendas belonged to a few owners while the majority of Mexicans starved to death. The quality of public education declined. 80% of the population was illiterate. There was no freedom of expression. The press was forbidden from expressing any opinion against the government, and strikes were prohibited for all sectors. Workers and peasants lacked labor protections and were therefore vulnerable to exploitation. Most workers had to work shifts of more than 12 hours for a meager wage of 75 cents. Repression and the use of force. Working conditions were appalling. However, when workers and peasants tried to express their discontent, they were brutally repressed. Examples include the murder of workers during the Cananea Strike, 1906, and the Rio Blanco Strike, 1907. Consequences of the Mexican Revolution. The Mexican Revolution is one of the first social revolutions of the 20th century and was responsible for bringing Mexico into the 20th century. Among its achievements and consequences, we can mention the following: Porfirio Diaz's resignation, promulgation of a new constitution in 1917, nationalization of land and subsoil, agrarian reform, reform of the public education law, nationalization of oil, improvement of the working conditions of the workers, creation of trade unionism, distribution of large estates among the peasantry during the Porfiriato. When did the Mexican Revolution end? Despite the general's resignation, the revolutionary movement continued in the following years, marked by discontent among the various factions that had initiated it, as acknowledged in the Mexican government article. Although they shared the ideal of political and social change, each group defended different interests. Although the struggle lasted for a longer time and some historians argue that the revolutionary struggle continued, there is a consensus that the end of the Mexican Revolution occurred in 1917 with the promulgation of the Constitution.